We're ready, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the American Geographical Society Council, our members and the staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this fourth Location Tech Task Force Blue Ribbon Panel. State and local experiences with mobile location tech, past, present, and future. To those of you participating in the conversation on WebEx, and those that are watching our live stream on Facebook, it's great to have you joining us this afternoon. We are proud to partner our Ethical Geo initiative with the Henry Luce Foundation to investigate the societal implications of geospatial technology and location tracking. Mobile location-based applications become ubiquitous in our society. As all of you know, they have changed the way we live our lives in a very short period of time. There are, however, problematic and unanticipated effects of using this technology. To better understand the ethical implications of its use, we have provided this platform to frame the discussion and to address these issues as they are already impacting our lives on a daily basis. COVID-19 has put a spotlight on the concept of using mobile tracing and surveillance to fight the pandemic. Around the world, the utilization of this technology to fight the coronavirus is being employed to various degrees, and already governments and people worldwide are faced with the issue of compromised privacy and what that means as we go forward. Over the past several weeks, our first 3 Blue Ribbon panels met and looked at ethical implications of mobile location technology and the impact on vulnerable publics from an international perspective and from the unique American experience. In addition, we had a panel of national security leaders who focused on mobile tracing technology and its use in national security and democracy, and the discussions were comprehensive and detailed. We also had the opportunity to hear from Ambassador Samantha Power, and she added the human rights aspect of the use of mobile technology. Today, we turn our focus towards the state and local point of view, contrasting the past, the present, and what may very well be the future. Over the next couple of months, we will continue to convene Blue Ribbon panels and leadership spotlights and collect testimony from other perspectives to serve as the basis of information and data that policymakers can use to help us guide the future. Before we begin, I would like to explain to those of you on our WebEx platform the best way to get the most out of today's panel. For those viewing on a desktop computer or laptop, we recommend you customize your viewing by hovering the mouse on the top right of your screen and selecting the icon in the middle. During our Q&A session later, to ask a question, hover your mouse under the arrow and click on the question mark icon in the gray bar at the bottom of your screen. For those of you using a tablet or mobile device, select the icon with the 3 dots, which will then allow you to select the question mark icon to submit your questions to our panelists. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Tucker, the chairman of AGS and our moderator for today's session. Chris, it's a pleasure to welcome you and your panel.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the team for getting us where we are today. Some may not know, but there's a hurricane ravaging the East Coast at the moment, and there's some lights flickering on and off behind some of our team members. So we'll see how our virtual event goes today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining our speakers and those of you online. The AGS is a 169-year-old organization that has convened government, industry, academia, and the social sector around the vital issues of the day through a geographic lens for 169 years since 1851. And today we are continuing in that tradition with leaders from public sector, private sector, social sector, and leaders in academia. Everybody here is quite accomplished, and I think it's only right for me to begin by reading their bios so you know who you're going to be listening to today. Miss Meghan Cook is Program Director at the Center for Technology in Government at SUNY Albany, where she leads innovative initiatives for international, federal, state, and local governments in digital government transformation. She is currently leading a project for the New York State Department of Transportation to identify the legal, infrastructure, management, outreach, workforce, cybersecurity, and data considerations in advancing intelligent transportation efforts. Some of her specialities include technology adoption in government, smart communities, and mobile and open governments. Ms. Kate Garman is Senior Associate at CityFi and has previously served as a technology policy advisor to the mayor of Seattle, where she was the policy lead on telecommunications and 5G, the first in the country city surveillance ordinance, and data governance. There, she created the framework and managed the mayor's Innovation Advisory Council. She also held the position of Smart City Coordinator in the Department of Information Technologies. And then we have Dr. Jeanne Holm. Jeanne is the Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles. She is also the high-profile Senior Technology Advisor to the Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti. Dr. Holm works on issues ranging from homelessness to digital equity, technology innovation, data analytics, and public-private partnerships. She held previous roles as Deputy Chief Information Officer and Assistant General Manager of the city's Information Technology Agency. Thank you to all three of you for joining us. I'm looking forward to this conversation. From a structure perspective for those in the audience, we're first going to hear from each of our speakers roughly 7 to 10 minutes on their thoughts on this topic today. We'll then move into an interactive Q&A with our panelists, and then we will end with questions from the audience. At any point in time, the audience should feel free, as Dr. Konarski explained, to put their questions into WebEx, and we'll be sorting those and making sure that they are addressed before the end of this WebEx. We see this very much as kind of public testimony, trying to get everybody's great ideas out on the public record for consideration by citizens, decision makers, business leaders, etc. So I'd love to begin with Ms. Meghan Cook with her thoughts on state and local experiences with mobile location tech, past, present, and future. Okay,
great.
Meghan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meghan Cook from the Center for Technology and Government at the University at Albany. I do have some slides prepared. I want to talk to you today a little bit about CTG, what we do, but also our thinking around technology investments that we've been focusing on for 27 plus years. So next slide. Yes, it works. And so there's my Twitter. Feel free to tweet. I know Kate put a great one out yesterday. I think you can go to the next slide. So again, let me just make sure I don't go over time here. CTG was started back in '93. We were initiated as a way for government to do risk-free exploration and innovation. And part of that is looking at different types of emerging technologies and how you fold those into the operations of government. All things that we know, back in '93, there wasn't a lot of organizations like ours. We know many of them right now. Next slide. So we have three main goals: knowledge creation, information dissemination, and capacity building. Actually, that picture there is city CIOs who come together a couple of times a year to talk about information sharing just in New York State. But we do this nationally and globally. But our Applied Research Center is just that. We focus on those three areas to build the capability of government and really to share what we're learning. We always say if we're learning something that affects local governments in the United States, it's probably affecting local governments throughout the world. So it's our job to share that information. Next slide. So we do that through working on policy, management, and technology, and we bring together government, university, and industry. These are applied research projects. We are experts in digital transformation. We're not experts in public safety or health and human services. That is what the government brings to the table. We're working on the problems that mean most to them. And industry brings the cutting edge knowledge and resources that they cultivate as part of their business. We have many academic partners from UAlbany and from across the United States and the world. We have the Smart Cities, Smart Government Research Practice Consortium, which right now has about 50 universities looking and comparing smart cities efforts across the world. So really, it's this mix of bringing everyone together in these projects, which is how I got to know the two other speakers that you're going to hear from today, Jeanne Holm and Kate Garman, who are also leaders in in their field. Next slide. Some of our partners, just wanted to give you an idea. So we've worked with police departments on developing performance objectives, all the way up to large NSF projects where we're building and studying knowledge networks throughout the world. So just a snapshot of some of the places we work with. Next slide. And also we play a role in educating the next public managers. And that is important, especially I think the conversation today around the use of emerging technologies and understanding the implications of those technologies on public policy problems is what we do at CTG, and hold many courses in order to incorporate those into their curriculum. Next slide. So what is technically feasible sometimes isn't always something you want to do. And I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today, especially in the discussion. Being on the cutting edge of technology means that sometimes technologists and IT folks get into the larger ethical conversations, which we think at CTG are really based around governance. So I always like this because I think it'll never go, I think we'll always be on the cutting edge, and it'll always be difficult to be there. Next slide. I was going to play a song, but I think everyone heard it. I feel like we've all grown closer to Alexa over these past few months, right? I can't see anyone, but I'm hoping you're shaking your head yes. And everybody knows the technology song. I can't stand the technology song, and my children have learned how to play it every time that Alexa hears my voice. So I think that, yes, Jean's laughing because this is what happens. And so we're not going to play the technology song, even though I embedded it in the slideshow, but Alexa's become more integral into our lives over the past couple of months, especially now that many of us are home. And so it brings the idea of location, personal location, residential location, to a different level of discussion, not only in your professional environments, but also in your personal environments. And that's why I wanted to put that in there, and because I had to listen to it so many times. Next slide. So CTG focuses on it's called the wicked problems of government. I'm sure that anybody listening to this knows that it's called that. They're complex, they're embedded, and I believe that the use of the mobile technologies for the gathering location data and in using it to inform investments and decision-making is one of those wicked and embedded problems. And if you look across the domains of government, many of those are local government, because that is a large focus that I've had over the past couple of years in helping them understand these emerging technologies and how they play a role in the larger governance. So really, CTG is looking at the area of public safety. What are the technologies used in public safety? How are body cams? How is that technology procured? What is the data management around it? How is that data used? What do the contracts say that allow the company to use the aggregate of that data? So, and that's just one example. If you go all the way down that list and you think about mental health. So when many of the folks in local government had to work remote, they had to use new technologies now to talk with their patients. And that data is now collected in places because those applications were made that way. So what can we do with that data? And as an aside, what we've learned is that that was successful in using those applications, at least in New York. Next slide. So I pulled this up. This is from 1999. CTG received an NSF award to bring together people to talk about digital transformation in this a global set of researchers. And the first thing that they say key needs were interoperable systems that are trusted and secure. And I think we're going to talk about trust today. Next slide. Actually, we're gonna skip this one. Next slide. So if we go back to basics and think about data and information, and we approach all of our efforts and all of our conversations in this way, if you think about government as the regulator of information flow in society, which we collect data, we use it, but also the producer, the provider, and the user. So we have to use our own data. And we're also charged with being the steward. So we are the stewards of the data, but sometimes being the steward of the data gets in the way of making it useful, but it can also make it better. So we many times balance these two different roles. And when it's embedded in an agency's mission, sometimes that can get even more clouded. Next slide. So when you think about location data, if we're talking to some of the smaller local governments, we think about, well, what is the data itself? The location, the person, the personal assets, the organizations, the organizational assets, the patterns of movement. But we also open it up and say, what other data could we be talking about? The data itself. And then how is it collected? Administrative systems. So your address is collected at the Department of Motor Vehicle, not by what they've tracked, but what you've given them. So if you think about all of the administrative systems throughout all the government agencies that have location data that are working with it, but also sensor technologies and mobile technologies. And then what are the uses? The organizational mission, is it data to meet the mission of the organization? To make sure that we have licensed drivers on our road? Is it a source of revenue? Are they looking out for a larger societal good, for education? So what are the other uses? So we really delve into just 3 categories when we're talking about location data. Next slide. But we also have a lot of discussion around analytics and use and collection and management. It's one of the areas that we really focus on because everyone wants the analytics. Everybody wants the thoroughbred, the racehorse, to see the pictures and understand and use the data to inform their investments. But collection and management, they have to be married. And sometimes what we find is this odd mixture of not so great collection and management, but we still want the high-end analytics and use. And so I'm where I live, I have a race course. And so I thought this was funny to put the two together. Next slide. We focus primarily on governance, and I know that there is a lot on this slide. But when you think about mobile technologies or even the use of location data by government, we think we break it up into different parts of the life cycle. So if you take system design and development, and we look at specific questions, and I only put a couple there. So what is the governance of the design and development? How are the embedded biases managed and communicated? Who is developing the system because they have embedded biases? What are the ethical and human-centered design principles? So we believe there's governance, and it's not the same group of people for each one of these. And if you go through to system procurement and implementation, one of the biggest questions there is, what are the terms and conditions in the contract that govern data ownership, privacy, use, sharing, and selling? Does everyone have the capabilities within their government to understand the contract terms and conditions? Data collection and management. Who are the key stakeholders? What are the policies and procedures? What are the quality measures? If you look at data use, which I've broken out from data sharing and selling, what is the makeup of the data governance body? What is the open data policy and platform they're using? What are the platform they're using internally, and who's governing the decision-making of that data use? Many times you'll find internally that departments will say, no, I don't really want to share my data. Well, it's not your data. So the governance is very different in each part of these components of the data lifecycle. And then the data sharing and selling, what are the governance policies, rules, and practices? So you can have regulations on the book, but what are the practices out there for sharing and selling? So I know it had a lot on this slide, but governance, we believe, is one of the critical components of understanding mobile technology. Next slide. Trust. I'll go through these quickly. Next slide. if you look at, we do a lot of work in AI and looking at trustworthiness, but I only pulled up two. So if you take the World Economic Forum, they are looking at two types, ethics-based approaches and human rights-based approaches. Now, you need ethicists, you need computer scientists together. You need public policy leaders together in those to talk about, a framework for decision making. What is fair? What is social justice? You need to bring ethicists to the table with those computer scientists, but also a human rights-based approach, which many are looking at in AI. And next slide. And one of the things that has been overwhelming in the past year is, if you look at the AI Institute down at New York University, they just came out with their 12 regulations. And all through these, it shows that there's not enough research in this area to be able to say adequately that AI is producing the results that are ethical or human rights based. And so I pulled this out on purpose because it's new research in this area, and it really starts to show that, there's the promise of AI, but government really needs to sit back and take a look at the governance in all of the life cycle areas. Next slide. Location data to take action. Next slide. I'm giving you some examples today that are about location data, not so much about mobile technologies for tracking. And then we're going to get into a discussion about that. So I wanted to save that for later. But the Community Officials Data Exchange is a platform where local governments, right now just in New York, share data on problem actors. It's a way to search in order to look beyond the LLC and try to match people together to properties and potentially addresses that they've used. So this location data, you can do mapping and find out if someone has a problem property anywhere in New York State if their data is in the Community Officials Data Exchange. So in this case, it's governments, it's shared with government leaders in order to take action against a person who has violations that are unresolved on their property, which here is under the Freedom of Information. So it is shareable with governments. So when we're thinking about location data, I wanted to give a couple of examples that are a little bit different about what we'll talk about later. Next slide. So again, we can pull up maps and do analysis about potential linkages between problem actors, meaning landlords, owners, and contractors and landlords in order to understand who is continuing to have the problem of vacant properties throughout the state. Next slide. But if we also think about organizations such as that run our roadways and our bridges, we have a very high-tech bridge in New York State. Massachusetts moved to the cashless tolling, but we also have problems of non-payment. So when we take location data and, the easy pass, we can figure out where we are, how fast we got there, when we went over the bridge. But when most of the revenue for those agencies comes through these types of tolls, then taking action against a non-paying driver uses the location data. And I bring these up because there's a thinking around those who are in violation in the rules that govern our states and our country, and location data for people who have not been in violation. And so that's one of the things I think we explore at CTG, and I've heard in many conversations. Next slide. So I'm going to close. I hope I'm not too over time. CTG looks at, we help agencies think about the public value. It's a return on investment that goes beyond dollars and cents. So they're making an action. In this one, we used an open government investment in programs, services, and infrastructure. And really, you can use any investment. You learn about what changes for each stakeholder. Is something more efficient? Is it effective? Do they have more transparency? And then what is the impact and the value for each one? Do they get, is there a stewardship value for the government because they've been shown that they can take care of the data, that they're not sharing it or they're using it in the ways that help increase the efficiency of the agency? And then what about across stakeholders? So when we think about investments, many times it's what's the return? What's the financial return? Whereas in government, the public value to different groups in our society is where we look. Next slide. So thinking about value in this way is really one of the lenses where we look at mobile technologies. We look at the use of location data and really help government agencies consider their best investments for their transformation. Next slide. So I really wanted to set the stage. I'm excited to hear from both Kate and Jeanne on some really good examples.
Meghan, thank you so much. I think, while the inspiration for this particular series of events was really COVID-19 and the concerns over location tracking and contact tracing, I think what you've just given us is, this isn't new, right? This is for decades. Governments have been working to manage data about all their different functions, to build trust, right, with the citizenry to make sure that you're providing meaningful, useful services, establishing some sort of governance that hopefully, earns the trust. But trust is something that's so hard to build and so easy to tear down, right? Particularly in kind of impersonal world of technology. But I think where you left us, I'm very intrigued for the Q&A. You said there's rules for people who are known to be in violation, right? And rules for people that aren't in violation. And we forget that, yes, we're all citizens. Yes, we all have rights. There is the Constitution. But then we have law, right? Where there are people who are bad actors, not bad actors. And things like COVID-19, who's in, who's out, what category are you in, I think gets very complicated when we think of, violators and non-violators. So I think this is going to be, that's great fodder for Q&A. So thank you so much for that, Meghan.
Great.
Next, we'll move on to Kate. If Kate's ready, we'll pass the microphone and get some great perspectives from her experience at City 5.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's such respect for my fellow panelists and the organization. So thank you. It's great to be here to talk with you today. So we could start with the next slide. So I'm going to talk about my experience with regulations. I know it sounds kind of like the negative side of the positive, how we can use data to better society, but you want to do it responsibly. And so I've worked for actually 2 cities. So you can go to next slides. I've worked both for Seattle and I worked for the city of Kansas City, Missouri, there for the mayor as the innovation policy advisor, working on one of the first smart cities in the country with sensors, public Wi-Fi and kiosks. And I'm a lawyer by training, but it's all basically how we get into the weeds. We want to do really great things, but we want to be responsible. And I'm your gal who's going to write, your ordinance or a memo to make sure that we're covering everything that probably hasn't been really regulated much before. So my work also covers Uber and Lyft, things that use your cell phones there. With a lot of transportation is really the industry when we're talking with cities and states. Meghan did a nice job talking about the bridges. The right of way is really where the rubber meets the road, if you will, on these sort of location devices. So we can go to next slide. This is just a preview of what I'm talking about today, hopefully setting up for some interesting questions and discussion about how cities think about privacy, how cities and states have certain obligations that are actually counter to privacy requirements, and then some other things that cities are doing, both in terms of principles as well as ordinances. Next slide, please. And we can keep going on to the next slide. We're talking about privacy first. So just to frame the conversation about how the law generally thinks about this, right? The law protects your privacy in the US Constitution, and it's mostly thinking about the government having your data. There's been just new conversation happening, and Jeanne, I'm so glad it's here. She's in LA in California, first state to pass a consumer rights data policy. But really, when we think about it for historical purposes, it's when the government has your data, because the government has power that the private sector does not. They can arrest you. Very flexible definition of what the government and the law historically thinks about when your privacy starts and ends. Next slide, please. And to you're expecting in terms of privacy when you're in this phone booth on the left, for example, you think that no one else can hear you. And in fact, if someone could, possibly your privacy has been violated. But on the right, in an open restaurant, there's an understanding that someone else can hear you. So this is a good demonstration of how your expectations matter in for your privacy rights. Next slide, please. And so, never before have we really thought about technology and the power of what's going to be in your pocket. Like my second grade teacher told me I'd never have a calculator. You also probably never thought that you would voluntarily put a device around you all the time that could track your location, right? You're primarily carrying that device to have originally phone calls, then texts, then emails, and everything else that has evolved with the cell phone. And so now when we're historically thinking about expectations of privacy, now we're really upping the ante as to what our expectations mean and the impacts of what the law carries around that in regulatory terms. Next slide, please. So I think that there's this real conversation that needs to be had, because if society is to help define their expectations with privacy, you really ought to know what that means. In the physical world, like 2 slides previous, you understand that, but again, it's hard to tell what's going on in your cell phone. For example, I once read that my weather app is checking my location every 14 seconds. Didn't know that, didn't realize that was gonna be, I thought every time I just checked on my weather, it was gonna click and see where I was. So I think there's this real knowledge gap with people and technology, especially with cities and states that have a responsibility to address. Next slide. So in one hand, we have that technology is changing, and so too are our expectations with it. But also we have cities are changing and how they use their technologies. There's a lot more technology going in the right of way. And I have been directly involved in these projects, and it's for the betterment of the city. It's to lower your traffic. It's to understand where we should put bike lanes. It's to make the right of way safer. So there are a lot of interests that cities have in putting technology in the right of way. And so both of these things are happening at the same time. It's a understanding of technology that you yourself as a person are using, as well as the city and how it's using and that legal expectation around it. Next slide, please. So I think when you're sitting inside a city hall, there's really 2 triggers that happen when you should be thinking about privacy as a government. One is when you're at the point of acquisition. When you are contracting with someone, if you're paying for technology, that's obviously one. And especially when you're doing right of way. So if and it's not even necessarily like if you directly are collecting it as a city with the sensor in your street. It's also if you're engaging a vendor that is collecting information in the street from your cell phone, from whatever else. That's really when these new things are happening that we should really think about privacy. And I want to note too that in the conversation, at least I'm presenting, we're not really thinking about police. Those have a whole host of different legal protections and consideration with warrant requirements and all those things. So for the point of this conversation, just want to flag these are non-police technology that we're talking about. So next slide, please. And I think that cities, especially in the last, I'll say 3 to 4 years, have really had to think differently, especially. One is protecting vulnerable communities. And A lot of interesting conversations here with, sanctuary cities and what's been going on the last 4 years with immigration law in our country. In Seattle, there was a request from ICE to get data from our utility department. And then the mayor put in some regulations that we really want to be careful in how we're collecting information about if we're collecting demographic information, for example, and asking about people's race or anything of that sort. So I think there's been a lot of good work on protecting data, particularly for historically vulnerable communities. And as I said, regulations are in flux. There's a lot of conversation both on the state level and the city level. The state of California, with their Consumer Protection Act, it went into effect January 1, 2020. It's a very young law that I think a lot of people are paying attention to and how it's going to work. The state of Washington just put in laws into effect for facial recognition. So there are things that are happening mostly at the state and local level, and not necessarily at the federal level just yet, for a variety of reasons, I'm sure. And then, of course, technology advancement. And this is where we can talk about, too, how you can get privacy protections, not necessarily in the laws that you write, but in the technology that you deploy. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about government obligations really quick. Go to the next slide. And this is acknowledging the tension that you want your government to be transparent and protect your privacy at the same time. And that's where we have the line of privacy regulation, really. FOIA laws, you want to be able to request transparency from what your government is doing, what data they're collecting about you, but you don't want to do it at the private level so that the government is giving away personally identifiable information or anything that might be risky to give on a general level. When I was in Seattle, we had the State Washington Public Disclosure Act, and I'm still not sure which way to put it, most conservative or liberal disclosure act, but basically it was extremely limited what was protected. My birthday as a staff was not protected, which made me a little nervous. And so that law was written in the 70s, and it really hasn't changed much. So there's not a lot of digital considerations that have happened to protect transportation data, for example, is a good one. And so this has led to a practical mission of the Privacy Office of Seattle, next slide please, that created the mission statement that they will only collect data that they need, and that's it. Because if you're filtering what you've already collected, you're too late in some sense, depending on your FOIA or relative state regulations of transparency. So next slide, cities around the country have started to create privacy principles, and we can go to the next slide. And so these are really to understand with your community, your efforts as a city to protect privacy. These I think are really important, likely step one for cities that don't have them already. A lot of cities around the country have them. I will say from when I was in Kansas City, Seattle was the first city to do it. We totally, took a lot of their language that they wrote. And there's been some good work that shows communities that it is a priority of the city. Next slide, please. I'm a particular fan of the city of Portland. They passed their principles just last year. And in particular, you'll see, I want to call it out, the equitable data management. And if you go further into their principles, they have a specific call out for vulnerable communities and ensuring that data is collected well in that way and respected. Next slide. I also want to highlight the brand new last week news from New Zealand on their algorithm charter. One, I'll just flag, I really do not understand why there's no Y in the word algorithm. Every time I misspell it, I'm going to learn it better. It's fine. But this is a great start, I think, to a conversation of using algorithms. But like privacy principles, they are not enforceable. It is really just a value statement. And that's an important distinction. For our next conversation, next slide, please. I understand, I'm sorry I'm going quickly, but I just want to set all this up for any questions that may follow. And I'm happy to cover this again and recap. So next slide. So Oakland and Seattle are the two cities that I still know of to this day that have a surveillance ordinance. It was passed in September 2017 in Seattle. The Seattle version, I think, is far more robust than Oakland in the sense of the topics it covers. Oakland really focuses on police use of surveillance. Seattle is technologies that are retroactive and future. The city of Seattle did an audit and found 29 technologies that were designated as surveillance. There are specific exceptions in the ordinance, such as body-worn cameras from police, monitoring major infrastructure like dams and acreage around utilities, things like that. But 29 pieces of technology were claimed as surveillance, including a technology called a cyclica that uses mobile data to monitor traffic. Next slide, please. And so I think this definition of surveillance is really important, especially when we're talking about mobile data and tracking. And the Seattle definition means to observe or analyze the movements, behaviors, or actions of identifiable individuals in a manner that is reasonably likely to raise concerns for civil liberties, freedom of speech, racial equality, or social justice. And then I'm going to go to the last sentence. It is not surveillance if you are voluntarily consenting and giving your information, or if there's a very clear and conspicuous opportunity to opt out. So that is the interesting definition. So we can go to the next slide, please. And this is really the meat of the process of the ordinance, which the city has to create a public report. They are on average 200 pages per technology. And the theme of what I'm about to say here for the surveillance ordinance is, while the mission is great and it's producing interaction with the community, it is very bureaucratic, and it takes on average 9 months to get to the process for each technology. So you have your 30-day public comment period. A surveillance working group was appointed, 7 people who represent historically vulnerable communities. CTO has a response. If something is violated, there is a private right of action the city can cure after 90 days. Next slide, please. This is my favorite slide. So I'll pause here. Everyone read this list. This is, I think, the meat and the potatoes of privacy law for cities and states, is this list. This list is in the ordinance for surveillance in Seattle, and it is what has to come out of the report and what really has to be agreed upon. Once the city council passes a technology law to move forward with surveillance, if there is any major change, they have to go back to council. And it's really on these pieces. It's describing what the technology is, who can use it and for what you're actually getting, how long you're keeping it, the cybersecurity piece, who can have access, training, and then of course, auditing and oversight. So I think this is really where cities who want to oversee surveillance and privacy should look at this list. And then finally, next slide, please. There are other options, right? There are other legal and regulatory levers to pull. One is the power of the contract, and that's with every vendor that cities get into contract with. Think about and work with your lawyers to talk about data retention, who owns it, who gets copies and licenses of the data, who is liable if something goes wrong with the data. There's a lot of work to be done here in terms of the power of the contract to reflect these things. There's also technology solutions, like I mentioned before. The sensors that we deployed in Kansas City had some edge technology, so we only saw the aggregate information and not any sort of real-time video tracking of individuals in the right-of-way. So there are technology solutions. They're somewhat challenging because you have to find a way to communicate with your city and your residents how that technology is working, and that's hard. That's really hard. So there's a menu of options when considering privacy. I really appreciated Meghan's slide on breaking it down in terms of design and use. That is exactly what this is doing, but by way of ordinance and by way of law. So you can go to my next slide, which is my last slide. That was a lot to talk about and preview, so I look forward to talking about it.
Okay, that was fantastic. I love how you started with, the right of ways are where the rubber meets the road. Not only was that kind of a very cute turn of phrase, but it makes me,
Thank you.
but it makes me think that, our expectation of privacy itself is geographic. You showed the old British phone booth versus the restaurant, but if I'm walking down a right of way, I have a certain expectation of my privacy versus in my home. And public policy can be written for a public right of way and what the city's responsibilities are and what our responsibilities are to each other as citizens, where that would be fundamentally different than what goes on in my house or on my private property. And I think that that's going to lead to some really rich discussion. And thank you for all those kind of concrete examples from various cities. I think we always know, what's the saying, the future's already here. It's just not distributed evenly or something like that. And there are certain cities that have thought this through and implemented it. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to get the word out to all those other cities that may not have the resource or critical distance to have kind of made those bold steps. So thank you for that. Jeanne, if you're ready, I'll pass the mic to you. Looking forward to your perspectives from the city of Los Angeles.
Sure, and thank you again. Great presentations, Kate and Megan, as always. So I'm going to be very much where the rubber meets the road and talking about 4 specific applications. One is all about COVID, so kind of ending us right back where I think you want us, and how we have learned about location data and how people expect it to be managed and what they expect to be private. So there's one thing of sort of like from a city's perspective, what we need to manage a service. The second is what people expect the city to do with that data that they gather. And that's helped to evolve, our understanding and helped us to make sure that we're being as respectful as possible for public and privacy. So I think you guys have my slides. Perfect. So the next slide just kind of focuses in, in the midst of a pandemic, a global recession, and, a very focused and appropriate discussion on racism in America, we are also trying to build a smart city. So in the midst of all of that, we are still realizing that as we move through some of those things, although that last one, the discussions on racism and how it's been embedded, not just into our society and our culture, but really into processes and technologies, that as we start to move through these, we also still need to keep an eye to the future, right? So we still have to pave the roads, we still have to feed the animals at the zoo, we still have to make sure the trash gets picked up every day. And in addition to running COVID testing centers and making sure that we're helping people know how to quarantine and be safer at home and all of those other things. So we use a whole slew of technologies in the realization of not just what we're doing with location data, but in what we're doing that also bears on location data. So for us, like as a city in Los Angeles, we have to always think of things in context with what we're trying to accomplish. Sometimes cities gather data either because it's just incidental to the kind of data that they're gathering. Maybe there's a, very sophisticated sensor they have on top of a streetlight, and that sensor they're gathering data around air quality, but it may have 4 or 5 other sensors embedded into it that are also gathering data that the Bureau of Street Lighting may or may not do anything with, but that's data that is potentially accessible, that may violate some of these issues that Megan and Kate had brought up. And so we really have to be conscious about when we are gathering data, what the use is of that data, who has access to the data, and to a certain extent, and maybe most importantly, is the sunsetting or removal of that data. So if I'm trying to get information on a specific action that has a very specific time frame, then I shouldn't keep that data longer than the time frame in which I need to make that decision. Otherwise, it becomes, potentially accessible for other things in the future that may be beyond what everybody had intended it to be. So we're using these different sorts of technologies, and we do all kinds of great things with them in a normal time, and even during COVID. We do gamification to help kids explore our public spaces. So they actually have an augmented reality game. They can go out into our parks and catch local flora and fauna and be able to learn more about them. We do machine learning, which I'll talk about in a moment. And all of these on the next slide are built around some of our infrastructure around transparency. So all of the data that we gather that can be made publicly available, we make available through our open data portal. We have a version that's just really sort of for data, but we also have an Esri GeoHub behind this. So if it's geospatial data, it's really easy to visualize it and layer different data sets together, which can really give people insights. by making a lot of this available publicly in an anonymized way. So we don't release, obviously, PII data, although there are a couple of exceptions I'll talk about, that we want to make sure that others can get insights that may be different than ours or have a different motivation than us as a city. And so we just want to be as transparent as possible with the data that people pay, our taxpayers, pay us to develop and provide. So in addition to this data, we also have, on the next slide, a pretty robust infrastructure. We were the first city to be 5G in the Western Hemisphere, maybe in the world, but I'm still arguing with Seoul about that. But we've been up for about 2 years with commercial Wi-Fi, commercial 5G available throughout downtown Los Angeles, and we've now spent 2 years building that out into our further out communities. The reason that these two things are important is that the ability to have 5G in place means that the densification of sensors and location data can be used in really innovative and interesting ways, but also starts to trigger some of these issues that we've been talking about. So when you have low bandwidth and low network capability, you're talking about scattering of sensors and maybe a scattering of data that you collect, but suddenly with this dense network that's fast and robust, you have both the opportunity but the responsibility to handle that ethically and carefully. The next slide really focuses that although it's great to have this infrastructure, we have, as every city in America, perhaps every city in the world, but certainly every city in America, we have a digital divide. So when we talk about location data and ethics and the kinds of things we're talking about today, we have to think about how this impacts people across the digital divide. So people who may not be able to get the benefits of having that location data because maybe they don't have a reliable network to access information that would come from the benefits of sharing information to the same extent that somebody who has a faster network does. And we also have to be aware that some people simply don't have any connectivity. So while they aren't in general then therefore sharing location data, specifically at least, they are also not getting any benefits potentially. And then the third piece is really around digital literacy. So we want to make sure that people have an expectation that their government is supporting them in whether or not they know the consequences of them sharing that data. So I think it was Kate earlier, or maybe it was Meghan who mentioned that California has a consumer protection law around this to really, and I know that to a certain extent, Apple and others look at the security around what kind of data is being gathered by apps in their Play Store, Play area and store. And so, there's a shared responsibility, I think, across the ecosystem for the things that we provide, the things that we collect, and the things that we support the distribution of, whether we're Apple or whether we're a city or whether we're a university research organization. So we have focused a lot for many years, but certainly definitely post-COVID, on the ability to get people free internet access or extremely low cost internet access. And so we built a site called Get Connected Los Angeles that, and we work and have an ongoing forum with all of the public telecommunications providers that make sure that the information for their lowest cost options and free options, particularly during COVID, is available to anybody. So you can just literally put your address in and find out what's available to you, or put your zip code in if you don't want to put your address. And we really focus on that to make sure that everybody's connected. School here starts in 14 days. I'm on the countdown, and we want to make sure that kids are able to successfully engage in that. We also have a variety of privacy policies, all of which are publicly available on our site. But we're in the midst of publishing a new City of LA digital code of ethics. So this kind of speaks to some of the things Kate just talked about, where we're really stepping up to not just how you should gather data and how you should protect individual data and PII and that kind of thing, but really the principles behind which we ask people to adhere if they are developing or co-developing something with or for the city. And the expectations that even if today we don't understand all the implications of something that we're putting together, that we understand the principles by which we will hold ourselves accountable and do that in a public and transparent way. So now I'm going to jump into just 4 quick examples of how we're using location data in LA and what we're trying to do to make sure that that is protected and used ethically. And the first one, I'm going to build a bit of a story and then quick for the last three. So the first one on the next slide is really around our mobility data. So there's a reason that, LA is #1 in traffic. And so we work a lot. CityFi has actually been a good partner in our urban mobility strategy. We work a lot on trying to understand what data we're gathering, how it can be used to make traffic less and to make mobility better, and to just increase the whole experience of trying to move from one part of Los Angeles to another. And we have a ton of different kinds of things that we have to think about. So there's, buses and cars. Blue LA here is an example of one of our very, very low cost electric vehicle rideshare programs in our underserved neighborhoods. We have drones, so many drones from our Port of Los Angeles, but all across the city. We have over 38,000 scooter permits. So we have a lot of scooters and micromobility. And all of these things are moving around the public rights of way, and we want them to do it in a way that is safe and equitable so that we're not leaving behind neighborhoods for whom micromobility might be a really important part of the equation to be able to get to a job because, all the people on the west side want to have scooters on the beach. So we have to think about that. And as we do, on the next slide, what we've done traditionally is set up data sharing agreements. So we work with Waze and Lime and Bird to share information about our curb coding. So like where are there places that it's safe and easy to drop off scooters so that they don't just get scattered all over the city. And with Waze, particularly street closures. Less now since we're not doing big public gatherings, but in a normal year with the Academy Awards and a lot of events in Hollywood, we know in advance when we're closing streets for festivals and events. And so we give Waze that information as well as our high traffic injury network, which is where we have problem areas for lots of reasons around traffic accidents. And so again, encouraging ways to both integrate that, but also think about how they can use that data, which has no specific individual location data, in a way that is it makes things safer. So here's a specific example where we shared general information that doesn't have any PII or individual information. Ways ingest that in a way that puts it out to an individual on a specific trip. We don't get back from them anything related to that individual trip. We in general want to have some sense of where traffic is moving, but we don't want any individual data. So that's a way in which we're providing data, but not getting back data that might have PII. What this has kind of led to on the next slide is really the need that we've had and that we have worked on for the last 2 years, which is the mobility data specification. So these individual agreements were difficult to start to manage as we had lots and lots of other mobility companies. And we also wanted to be equitable to startups. So like somebody coming in with 10,000 scooters could get a data sharing agreement, but then we were also trying to deal with the people coming in with 50 scooters. So we created the data mobility data specification. It quickly got adopted by a lot of different cities, and we've actually spun up the Open Mobility Foundation and put that off the city and into a nonprofit that now manages this. So this is available on GitHub, and what it does is it defines the kind of data that we want to be able to capture and share with first micromobility, but right around the corner we have autonomous vehicles, and transparently talks about those kinds of data that we would share back. So we need to know if a bunch of scooters are being dropped off in a certain location and we don't have a car, like a cutout or a safe place to drop them, we can change the infrastructure in the built city around that if we know that. We don't want to know that Chris has taken a scooter from point A to point B. No offense, but that isn't useful to us. What is useful is that 50 scooters got dropped off at Venice Beach at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. That we need to know so we can help to manage that space so there's a safer place to put them off the sidewalk. So that's the kind of data that we've been working with all these cities and all these providers to be able to start to put together in a way where we can say specifically how we are using this data and what data we're gathering about individuals, which in our case is nothing. Now, the mobility companies themselves obviously know their customer base, but that's not part of what we're gathering. So the next slide really is the idea that, you know, we're moving forward with all of this to try to make the things better. This is a project we're doing with the Toyota Mobility Foundation. And you can see here, hopefully it's coming through on your computers, we're looking across city spaces, particularly around intersections where we're having bikes and scooters and people walking. And we're doing a counting mechanism so we can adjust the timing of the street lights, the traffic lights, to make it safer when we have a lot of people in a space. And when we don't have many people, then we can make it flow faster for cars. Now, if you wanted to, you could potentially do facial recognition on this. I mean, they're pretty crappy old cameras. These are not new cameras, and that was the whole point of this. But we don't want people to do that. So once we've counted the people in the space, it's really not interesting to us anymore to have that data. We've kind of used it almost near real time. And so we flush that video data out so that it can only be used for its intended purpose, which is to make sure that we're accommodating people in that time in the real space. So that's one of the ways in which we're trying to make sure that if we collect information, which while we're not doing facial identification, could potentially be used in a way that people in public rights of way is not intending. And then, of course, you know, we're doing this as part of our build up to autonomous vehicles and autonomous flying vehicles on the next slide that are really part of our build up to the 2028 Olympics. So there's a one point of joy we can share. The next slide talks, and I'll cut through these ones pretty quick. One of the applications we've had for a while, this is Shake Alert LA, one of the ones that my team built. So Shake Alert LA works with the U.S. Geological Survey and gives you a notification in advance of you feeling the shaking of an earthquake. Doesn't predict an earthquake, but basically as soon as the shaking starts, an electronic signal goes to you and says how intense the shaking will be at your location, generally 10 to 30 to 60 seconds ahead of the time. It just depends how far you are from the epicenter. And so this must know your location, because I can't tell if you're in Seattle, then you don't need a notification if the earthquake's in LA. But if you're in downtown LA and that's where the earthquake is, and you'll need to know it's severe. So in this case, what we do is we gather that, this was a long public discussion. We gather that location data, ping it off your cell phone, and then we assign you to one of 60 geographic grids around the city, and then we flush the individual data. So literally for a microsecond, we know only that this phone, not that it's Chris, but this phone is assigned to grid 58. And if there's an earthquake, we will assign that object. It'll get that phone, will get the notification assigned to object 58. And so it's one way in which we try very hard to make sure that no data is actually resident to the city for people's location. But in a case where location is absolutely essential to delivering the service, that we do it in the most private and transparent way. So when we get to an application like this, it becomes very tricky to make sure we have this transparent public conversation and do it in a way that still lets us deliver the service. On the next slide, this is a project we're actually doing for NASA called Predicting What We Breathe. So in this case, we're using machine learning with large data sets, satellite data from NASA and the European Space Agency, and then also data from our ground sensors. So these are air quality sensors all around the city. And then we use machine learning to be able to predict what interventions that the city what effect interventions that the city may have on improving air quality. So this is an interesting assignment. One of the things we're doing here, though, is we're doing some citizen science activities where individuals who want to can take an air quality so we provide air quality sensors, low cost ones, and they can take them home and put them up. So if they have asthma or they just want to participate, they could put it up at their location. So this is one where they have chosen to share that data from their location, which could be at a school, but it could be at their home. And there's a bit of anonymization in that you don't know who it is, but you do know the general location within several hundred yards of where that sensor is because the data is made publicly accessible. So this is an area where we want to make sure that we're letting people participate but we also anonymize everything except basically the air quality data that's coming from that location. So again, as when the rubber meets the road, Kate, this is where some of these questions about how we handle this come to play. So the last example I'll give quickly is all around COVID. So on the next slide, we provide a wide variety of data around COVID. We have dashboards. A lot of the data that you have seen, I'm sure, from like Johns Hopkins and others, is at a pretty high level. So that data is at a state or maybe at a county level. And while it's really interesting, it's a lot less actionable than data at a neighborhood level. So one of the things we've had to do is really work with our county public health and our state to disaggregate the data so that it becomes something we can act upon. So for example, we know that, so LA was the first city to offer free COVID testing to anybody, whether they were asymptomatic or not. So if you were just worried, maybe you were, going to go visit your elderly parents and they're at risk and you wanted to make sure that, and you weren't feeling well, or maybe you were feeling well, but you want to make sure you hadn't had COVID, you can get testing. Those are, like many cities, drive-up centers. What we realized, as has become obvious, I think, to many people, is that COVID does not treat everybody equally. Communities of color, poorer communities are much higher risk for a variety of reasons, which we can go into later. And so what we thought is, well, it's not just being safe like a drive-through testing. We need to have walk-up options. So we actually use the disaggregated data of the incidences of COVID in our neighborhoods. So we take it from the county down to the city, down to our 99 neighborhoods in LA. And we said, in this neighborhood, we have a much poorer group of people. There's high incidence of COVID. We need to put a walk-through, like a walking clinic there for testing because people don't have cars. Like, how are they going to get testing if we tell them they have to drive up? So we've used the data, the location data, to be able to do that. And then we've also disaggregated our data to look at the ethnicity as well, and some of the socioeconomic vulnerabilities. One of the things we realized was that we didn't know how risky it was. Like every day, people were making the decision about leaving their home to go to work, to go to the grocery store, to go pick up food at a restaurant, and they were making decisions without understanding if there was a risk involved. So a risk more in one neighborhood than another. So we created this global COVID computational challenge. And what we did was we had over 400 people from 4 different continents compete and on looking at whether or not you could create a risk score for a location. This isn't for an individual, but for so if we knew that a business there had a lot of cases, because we track the cases for a business or a nursing home, if we knew that the R factor was really high in that community, if we knew that there was a lot of traffic going in and out of that community, we looked at mobility data, that we could potentially create this risk score. So in our backyard, USC won the challenge. And they have an open source GitHub lab, which I've linked here if you want to show the slides later. And that GitHub model provides the ability to apply, basically you could plug in any city's data into that model. As part of this though, we realized that this information could be made, could be biased very quickly. And since we were working with global community, there was a lot of different cultures of participants. And so we had, a fair number of participants from China, and part of their approach to data privacy was different than some of our American teams, which was different than some of our Brazilian teams and our Egyptian teams. And so what we did is we did a couple of focused training sessions. One was specifically about fair and ethical use of data and inclusiveness and diversity. And we talked about bias in the algorithms. We talked about issues of the data, about, you can't just ask everybody, you can't basically put ankle bracelets on everybody and make them stay in their homes for 2 weeks until they've quarantined. And part of this was us breaking down the data, again, as disaggregated as possible. So when we think about COVID, it's not just tracking where the outbreaks are, but trying to help give people information that's going to give them safe behaviors, which I think we all do pretty well, but also understand if I'm at risk, if I have an issue, then I need to know if going to one grocery store versus another grocery store might put me at a greater risk. So that's part of how we've been trying to use the idea of location data specific to COVID, but also understanding that there's an inherent potential risk of introducing a bias or discriminating against communities that are at higher risk for reasons well beyond their control. Thanks very much.
Great. Is that it, Jeanne?
That's it. We're
Excellent.
just, yeah, so we are using location data in lots of ways. And as we do, we find sometimes we have to put these structures in place, whether it's the code of ethics or the mobility data specification, to be able to start to guide us and our partners in better ways.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, I was kind of taken when you started talking about the densification of sensors and location data. You almost invoked the Peter Parker principle from Spider-Man, you know, like with great power comes great responsibility.
Great data comes great responsibility.
That's right. And I think that's definitely true. So I appreciate that perspective. And, you know, I also appreciate you gave us not just the COVID-19 example, but, you know, this is baked into how you run your city, like in so many different ways. I think, you know, Meghan started us off in that, and you finished us off there. Location tech, location data is at the heart of how you think about managing your city, the provision of services, and ethics, and you know, ideally the avoidance of bias, or at least the recognition of bias, is something at the heart of what you do. So I think that's going to lead to a ton of great questions. Thank you for that. So I think I'm actually going to go ahead. You know, we distributed some questions to the speakers earlier on to try to suss out some of the big issues. So I think I'll start with those. And the first one is, you know, we just ended with COVID-19 with Jeanne. I want to continue with that. And I'll just kind of ask the broad question and let you guys kick it around amongst yourselves. How do state and local leaders think about the utility and risk of mobile location tech in combating COVID-19? Maybe just in your city, or things you've heard from folks in different cities. Maybe they think about it differently in different parts of the country because of how cities are organized. I know it's a big, broad question, but how do state and local leaders think about the utility and the risk of mobile location tech in COVID-19? Do some just not want it at all while some are embracing it? Jeanne, I see your mic is hot. I don't know if you want to jump on that first or pass it over to Kate.
I'll just set it up for Kate and Meghan. So I think the idea, like if we jump into contact tracing, right? So something that's very specific, it's a mix, right? So Apple and Google came out some months ago with the API to be able to, for cities and municipalities and state governments to be able to build something. I was talked to a lot of CIOs and city leaders around the world, and part of our challenge is, you know, people don't necessarily stay in the same geographic location, right? So if it's much more likely that somebody from LA is going to Phoenix or up to San Francisco or even to Paris. So as I mentioned earlier, we don't treat data privacy the same way from the European Union and GDPR to Los Angeles to Beijing. And so part of our challenge, I think, is how do we manage this in a way that's not artificial, where we're expecting people to stay in a super hyper local location. As a city, we're interested in, you know, we do a very aggressive contact tracing, but it's all people centered, and trying to motivate people to go in and get tested and motivate people to quarantine if they're not feeling well. And I think that is, you know, part of the challenge is that this pandemic has happened when we're sort of in between a non-technical and technical set of solutions.
Great. Kate, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I do not envy, there's a lot of conversations for cities. You know, Jeanne is just one of a city leader among others trying to figure out the contact tracing. I think that there's a lot of people element to it as well. For example, if let's say we figure the privacy thing out and I get pinged that I've been around someone who's later tested positive, there is some assumption that I will change my behavior because of that. Like I can, either because I can, not go to work because I'm a non-essential worker or something like that. And I think, we talk a lot about the data and the regulatory piece, but there's also the people part of it, and whether or not the cost of figuring out the privacy piece is worth the benefit, and people will actually take into consideration, that news. I think there's two other ways too that cities are thinking about data with COVID. One is, this has produced a huge economic impact to especially small businesses. And I think really trying to communicate with small businesses on how they can get city and state resources is a big piece. And then the third, which is something I'm particularly passionate about, is this is all happening in the middle of the census. And how can we make sure that we're reaching out to hard to count areas, especially, with vulnerable communities that have trust. To Meghan's point earlier about the trust piece, it's huge. So using the data to get those things moving is big for cities right now.
Great, thanks, Kate. Meghan, do you have a comment?
Yes, so I work with primarily cities and counties who don't even compare to LA. They often come into the conversation saying, we want what LA's doing. Well, of course, we all do, okay? So when you think about the resources that they don't have data teams. They don't have the resources to think about it. They've just moved their workforce remote. They've assembled emergency teams. They've helped set up hospitals. So when I talk to them, the idea of using an emerging technology to them, maybe not emerging in every place, is something they want to do, but they've just expended all of their resources in order to respond to the pandemic. Okay, and so that is primarily where I spend a lot of my space, and so thinking about how the data will be used. I know there's some counties who don't even have a Department of Public Health, and so their data could never be. They were never getting it at a granular level, and it raised other concerns like, why don't we have a public health department? And so when I see what's going on in LA, absolutely, I know what's going on in the other mega cities, but for the mid-size, actually even the smaller, the conversations are a little bit different about where to expend resources and what is going to be the return for an investment in that area.
Really appreciate. Go ahead, Jeanne.
Yeah, I was just going to add something, Meghan. So, thank you. I'm glad people like what LA does, but we always just feel like we're running. So you'll notice that was a COVID computational challenge to a global community because we didn't have the answer and we didn't have the resources. So we basically found a local organizer who was effective, willing to jump in, and we just opened it up and we got a few people to sponsor some prizes. And then we also have I think we talked before about this, Meghan, a data science federation. So we put together 18 universities in California and Arizona that support city departments at 88 different cities to give free services from students and professors related to data science. Right now, several of those teams are obviously going to be focused on COVID, but there's a great group, Albany is one of them, but there's a great group of universities in every city or near every city who's willing to help. I think cities need to think that they're not in it alone, because I think a lot of us do feel that way in some cases, because we're just being asked to do so much that we haven't traditionally done. But there's a big community that can help and can be part of this.
Right. I don't know if Meghan had a rejoinder to that, but something she was talking about. When we're talking about COVID-19, we're bucketing people as they've contracted it or they haven't contracted it, or maybe they did and now they have the antibodies. So we are bucketing people. But I'm still very taken at the beginning of Meghan's presentation when she talked about rules for people in violation of the law and rules for people who are not in violation of the law. So that's a different bucketing, right? So when you've geared a lot of your information apparatus and enforcement around those that could be policing, not related buckets, has it been a struggle? Like how have cities adapted that to a thing that isn't really about guilt? It's about a health status that has both private and public implications, and so we have to get in your business, right? But then that overlaid with your location and your pattern of life, gets really kind of invasive.
Yeah, so let me just start here, because when you brought it up the first time, I've been thinking about it. And so when you think about the use of location data in order to take an action, say in owning vacant properties, trying to reduce the amount of vacant properties, that individual has taken an action and broken the regulations around keeping properties up. When people are using tactics where they may not be paying to use roads and bridges, they're taking an action by which to go against the rules of the agency, of the state. When you're dealing with COVID, it's different because they're just being. They're simply being. They're not actively taking an action. And so that's where I think it's the intent. It's harder to put people in buckets when you're dealing with the contraction of a virus, which you simply get just by being. And so that's there can be examples of the use of administrative data to take action, but I'm not completely convinced about same action with COVID.
Yeah, no, I don't know that I have a counterpoint to that, except for, some people would say they take the action to go to a bar on a Saturday night, and they took an action not to wear a mask. But then the counterpoint we've had on some of our international panels is countries like Norway that, started doing contact tracing and then they hung it up. They just said, this can end in no good, right? Having this much information in the possession of the state somehow, even if people are, skirting the regulations or flaunting them or flouting them or doing whatever, somehow the enforcement side of this is never going to end up somewhere positive. And I just think it's an interesting thing because we don't necessarily have the right categories and models, from our prior experience to just graft into this new situation and, snap our fingers and everything will be hunky-dory. So
yeah. So one more thing, I've talked to about, 50 or 60 small government leaders, mostly IT. And one of the things that resonates all the time with me is that they said, this virus has forced me to have conversations around philosophy, my beliefs, when typically I'm just setting up infrastructure and helping set strategy for, emerging technologies or replacing legacy systems. And so that's really what's resonated, is that so many people are in a situation to have these conversations internally in their department, and it's bringing people's belief systems to a level which I would say most of them have said it's a good thing. It's created stronger relationships in their governments.
Great. So I'd love to move on to another question. Since action on the ground notoriously around COVID-19, right? And beyond, since action on the ground notoriously involves agencies from overlapping jurisdictions and with different legal authorities, how do you think about the operational sharing of citizens' mobile location data? I can only imagine LA is just a massive, melange of different overlapping jurisdictions. I don't even know how you know who to call to find out what jurisdiction is. But Jeanne, do you have any thoughts to open us up on that?
Sure, I just call Ghostbusters, but yeah. So So what we found, again, I think I mentioned earlier that, open data is a team sport. It's an ecosystem. And there's a lot of people who care that we stop COVID and a lot of people who want to help. And we have a program called Data Angels as well, where people who are data scientists or storytellers or somehow involved in the data world can volunteer. And we've had just this onslaught of people volunteering to be angels, which is very helpful and sweet at the same time. And so there's a program at UCLA, which is one of our local universities, that is called Stop COVID Now. So this kind of relates into, and I've seen a couple of questions come up in the Q&A too, the idea of like, some people don't want to have anything, don't want to be surveilled at all, right? For whatever personal choices and concerns they have, they don't. But other people are also happy to be part of, experiment or prototype or understanding. So UCLA, not the city, and we don't have access to this data, but UCLA lets people self-declare if they're feeling symptomatic that day. And they've got maybe 60,000 people participating. So it's a pretty big group voluntarily, maybe not every day, but close to. And that gives UCLA epidemiologists a little sense of like, are we starting to see more symptoms? Because we need to find more leading indicators of COVID in order to stop it. We all see the lagging indicators, like we see the deaths, we see the hospitalizations, we see the confirmed cases. We need to know when people get exposed more or when they are starting to feel bad, even if it turns out not to be COVID. That helps us to understand, is there going to be an uptick in hospitalizations? Is there a surge we have to prepare for? Do we need to get more testing out to certain communities or locations? And so I think that programs like that, where people can choose to opt in, are really great. UCLA then shares totally anonymized general neighborhood level data with our county Department of Public Health. So I think Meghan maybe mentioned earlier that a lot of cities don't have public health offices. We don't. We use the county's public health office. And so if we know that there's a lot of symptoms happening in, say, Westchester, one of our communities, then if the county's contact tracers know that, they can double down when they know that there's an outbreak, there's some cases there, or there are people who've been exposed there, so that they can try to focus and put a stop on the areas where we're seeing emergent hotspots as well. But that lets people choose to share.
Great, wonderful. Kate, would you like to also talk about overlapping jurisdictions and the hot mess that must be?
Yeah, I was going to say, listen, I love cities. I love cities with all my heart. But even getting data between two different departments within a city can sometimes require a data sharing agreement. I mean, I think that COVID has shown some opportunities of where the government can work better. It's always been a problem cross-jurisdictionally. If you think about how you have to register your car at the DMV and then register it for taxes are two separate events. Like, I mean, this is now kind of that among multiple jurisdictions. So multiple jurisdictions have different laws as well. It is something for the government to work on. I think the state of Indiana had someone as their state CTO who made data sharing agreements immediately with all the state agencies to help the movement of data across the state. And so these are things I know cities are working on. Certainly open data is actually one of the easiest ways to do it. If you put something in the, when I was in Kansas City, I went on our open data site all of the time to find data across different departments. So I think it's something that governments are working on, and there's a lot of opportunity there.
And Meghan, New York State, talk about jurisdictional.
Oh, so actually what I want to talk about is that, so CTG did research right after 9/11 and the West Nile virus. And there's a lot of learning that occurred there, and information sharing was prevalent. So we wanted to know what could be longstanding. And essentially, I'll boil it down, is that rules fall away during that time because you're in a crisis, and people assume leadership roles. If there was a group in New York City that had just completed the maps of New York City, so they went into an authoritative role. So other rules fell away and they could share data. Some of that stayed, but primarily once you get past the crisis phase, data sharing goes back to what it was before. And so one of the things is that we always focus on is what can we take from the crisis and help government put into long-term statute for information sharing, which is what Jeanne and Kate were talking about around the data sharing agreements, getting those set up. So that's really what I want to talk about is thinking towards the future based on what we've learned from other crisis.
Excellent. A similar question, but about kind of the interface between public and private. How do you think about public and private sector partnerships and collaborations around mobile location data and its integration with locally gathered data? Jeanne, I think you gave some great examples of a lot of the corporate partnerships you have, particularly in the micro-mobility space, and the difference between the data they may collect, right, that I as a consumer know they have about me, and the information, kind of the subset of that information that you need to properly govern your city. But I don't know if you want to take another shot at that or whether we just want to pass the baton to others. But it seems like, you know, the nature of this mobile location tech is it's going to be about a public-private handshake continuously, and that'll just intensify over time. Jeanne?
Yeah, I think so. And part of the reason we did our soon to be published code of ethics was the idea of just being more transparent about this with our partners and with the public. After this code of ethics, which is really meant to be like how we co-develop solutions and software and algorithms and use of data, we're actually going to be publishing a Bill of Rights. So this is for the expectations of what people should expect on the streets of Los Angeles. Okay, so we don't, there's lots of businesses and they're going to do what they want within their own sort of, specific geography. But the idea is that when you're walking down the street of Los Angeles, we and our city attorney want to defend your right to certain expectations of privacy. So we're trying to define that. Obviously, that's going to was supposed to be a set of public meetings. We obviously are going to do the set of virtual public meetings now to try to get back information for what people expect and try and understand what ability we have as a city to encourage, govern, cajole, threaten companies to respect what people want, to be able to walk down the street with a certain sense of anonymity, which is what, the kind of the feedback we're getting.
Great. Would anybody else like to pick that? Kate, I mean, in all your smart city efforts, public and private play prominently in kind of your descriptions.
Yeah, and same with Smart City in Kansas City and the Innovation Advisory Council in Seattle, working with amazing companies. For example, Zillow had such rich housing data when we were trying to approach our affordable housing crisis that the city could never get, frankly. And so I think that it's absolutely key as we keep trying to solve these huge issues that we're going through right now in 2020. And the last thing I'll say too is I want to highlight what Jeanne said of when she was talking about the mobility data. Cities don't want personally identifiable data, nor do we even have the capacity to deal with it. I say we because I'm with City 5, but once you're in the fam, thank you, Jeanne. And Meghan's in the fam, she's in the fam. But once the amount of data that can come with that can be so great that when you're at a city, you really need to focus on priorities. And so those public-private partnerships allow you to open up your capacity and expertise and having those fundamental things in place, like we've talked about, so that we make sure that we're not taking in the data that cities don't even want, and you're off and running.
Great. Meghan, public and private?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Jeanne and Kate have said. For what I've learned from the IT leaders in New York is that the vendor relationships were absolutely critical. I've heard time and time again they said we wouldn't have been able to carry on the services. We wouldn't have been able to do anything if it wasn't for the vendors who stepped up to the plate. I believe, again, this has strengthened their relationship. Of course, moving ahead in partnerships for technologies, you have to have a very serious review of the contract, as I think Kate had all of the major elements there. But the relationships that they've had in the past came through, and they had nothing but great things to say about the folks they've worked with.
Great. Not to throw one back at Meghan, but something Meghan said a few exchanges ago about the different geographies in New York State, right? Like an urban area versus a rural area. They're just kind of fundamentally organized differently. They have different capacities, public sector capacities at the state or the county level. And they may not be in a position to harness data the way an urban area could. What kinds of, I'll kind of pass this maybe back to Meghan to kick it off again and pass it around, but stated differently, what kinds of geographies, whether they're rural versus urban or wealthy versus poor or digitally connected versus digitally challenged, what kinds of geographies pose different challenges in the application of data-driven strategies against COVID-19 and other big, big challenges? How do mobile location technologies overlay across this geographic complexity, and what challenges do you see in their ethical use? That's a huge set of questions there. Just treat it like a playground and do whatever you want with it. How about that?
Okay. That was a big question. So when we're talking about data-driven strategies, you find the smallest places with not a lot of resources, and they have a passion to use data. Okay, they want to understand why their parking meters are not bringing in the finances that they were promised by the vendor. So they will do everything they can to get that data, but using data to inform investments is an innovation itself. And in innovation theory, it takes a champion. So that's what we learned many times. And I quote Kate's former colleague, Eric Roche from Kansas City, who always has said to me, if you want to use data, go find the people, because the people know how to talk to everyone, how to get an understanding of what makes sense, and then find the champion in there to use the data. So it's really hard to say that it's urban, rural, it's geographically based. I believe it's based on the person there who has an interest to use the data. Now, resources help. One of my favorite sayings is I often talk to IT leaders who are in this mid space, and they say every day is a pull between the Jetsons and the Flintstones. So I have, we've deployed some sensors, and we're getting this data, but on the back end, I'm like the Flintstones, and my feet are running underneath. Okay, so while they want to use data, and they may have a way to collect it, they may have a person who's a champion, if all of their resources are to these legacy systems that they're still trying to keep in operation to run government services, then many times they're not able to focus there. With that said, again, there's been a couple of small municipalities who've just come shining through in their use of data, and nobody would have expected it, but they had a champion there. They had a person who understood data, who leveraged universities, all the organizations out there. So I'll stop there and let Jeanne or Kate jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Meghan. Kate, I know it was a big word salad jumble of a question with a lot of stuff in there, but I don't know. You want to pick up on it?
Yeah, I like the question, Chris. It's an important one because there are definitely things to consider even in your own community. Meghan has such a great point of view because she works with so many cities. That's important to think about. I think working in your own city, you need to think about how certain communities like to hear from their government. The city of Seattle did a digital equity study in 2018 and asked people how they want to hear from their government. And a lot of them were through, snail mail. The city of Kansas City does a resident satisfaction survey with a 50% nearly response rate, and much of that is through snail mail rather than online. So it's not just areas of your community that might not be as connected. It's age demographics. It's all of that, especially in COVID, when a vulnerable community, as you'll see in the Seattle results, is senior citizens have a really hard time adopting to technology, and reaching out to that is a particularly good thing to focus on during COVID.
Great. I'll tell you a story about my elderly mother soon. Yes, Jeanne, not sure if you want to pick up on this.
Just to kind of build off what Kate just said, is that the challenge, I think, is understanding the best way to communicate to people, and both language too. So we have 220 languages spoken in the city of Los Angeles, which makes things a little complicated at times. And when we're talking about something as important as COVID or answering the census, we want to make sure that people understand that, in a way that's comfortable to them, in a language that's trusted by them. So we do have to think about not just the wording that we're doing in the linguistics, but also we do a lot of sentiment analysis around the languaging that we do. Because if we're asking people to, nobody wants to have a lockdown, but people understand safer at home. What should you do? You should be safer at home. And so, we think a lot about that. We look at how people react to that because we're trying to motivate them for safe behaviors, particularly right now. And then the other thing I think that's important is we have to do multimodalities. So we do I run 3 television stations for the city. We do social media. We've got a lot of celebrities here in Los Angeles. And so we've had a bunch of celebrities promoting the census recently, and doing mask wearing. And, the idea is that whether it's digital or analog, whether it's through community ambassadors, it's posted in your local businesses, you have to get everybody on board to get that message and that information communicated effectively across the digital divide, across different partisanships, because these are things that affect all of us in a way that we all want to be safer and healthier.
I think that's great. I've been looking at the questions that have been coming in off Facebook Live and from our WebEx community. And the question I was getting ready to read, I think you just answered, but I'll read it for Kate and Meghan. How do you work to include especially vulnerable, but not necessarily data-heavy populations, such as those who are homeless and undocumented, in your plans and analyses? Because I think it is, how do you communicate with them? I mean, a homeless person doesn't get snail mail. You might like to have a house where you receive snail mail, but probably doesn't have a cell phone. And then, of course, even if you can find a way to speak with them in a way that they could receive the language, right? The actual language you use is very important in how you connect with them and their values and interests. Kate, I just see your mic went hot. How should we think about that, or how do you see that challenge?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will give my response, but there are certainly better iterations than what I'm about to say. I think that we cannot underestimate the power of established grassroots communities that are not online. There are cities, large and small, that have Department of Neighborhoods who have neighborhood leaders that are not employed by the city, that are fundamental to communications by and from the city. So those are ways of which we have to use our organic channels and do just on the ground. Now, during COVID, especially when you can't do that, it's especially challenging. I would love to hear more from Jeanne. I'm from the city side of what's going on there, since I've been out of the city hall since January. But I think it's a full gamut of things. It's a full menu of options.
Great, Meghan.
So one of the things that years ago, I was listening to a speaker from General Services Administration, and when he was talking about what his job was, he goes through the many functions, but he said so much of his job is helping government leaders figure out what is in their space and what you should leave to others who can do it better than you. Okay, and that runs at many levels. So when I think about the vulnerable populations, and of course, I'm like Kate, there's many people who can speak to vulnerable populations, but there are, if you were to characterize them as third party faith-based organizations. There's so many organizations that provide these services. They already have a network in place. So they're receiving funding from the government, but their network is rock solid. So what I would do is take that idea of what are they already doing better? So I would leverage those networks in order to get data from and to those vulnerable populations.
I'm just going to jump on for one more thing. During COVID, we realized so we have a large homeless population, as do many other large cities. We realized that could potentially be like a powder keg for COVID transmission, especially because there's a fair number of elderly in our homeless population. So within the space of, I think it's all a blur, but it seems like it was 4 weeks, we housed 4,000 people. And so we originally closed all of our rec centers and converted those into homeless shelters, which gave us a way to bring people off the streets and also to get them the information that they needed, right? So we could teach them like, okay, this is, this is the hand washing, this is mask wearing, these are all the things. And we could also have a nurse resident to be able to check symptoms throughout the day for everybody as they came in and out, but also while they were resident there. We have since moved to a program called Project Room Key, which moves those people mostly out, we're just finishing that up, out of our rec centers and into hotels, which does two things. One is it allows us also to put people who have COVID or are symptomatic in individual rooms at those hotels and still be able to be housed. And it provides an income to the hotels, which and to the workers at the hotels, which is an important economic aspect. So I think that there's ways to do this that can reach to those populations, and that in moments of emergency like this and uncertainty, like what is the best way to solve several of these problems together?
Great. Thank you, Jeanne. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Another question that came in off of our Facebook stream, and I kind of love this just because we've kind of already answered it, but yet it's, I think, a persistent question that's going to come from some quarters, and it's probably worth responding to again. So from Facebook, I'm having a hard time conceptualizing what my location data could be used for other than policing and being sold to big businesses. Can you tell us, please? And I sit there and go, I mean, there's just some people, like, they're just looking at all this going, well, it's going to be government and big business and they own me. What good could possibly come from this? Even though, I think you've laid out many great examples of what city of LA, Seattle, Kansas City, and others have done. Maybe we could answer the question, but also, like, how do you have a conversation with somebody that's coming from that headspace, which frankly, I see a lot of validity in that worldview a little bit, so you got to come to people with their suspicions. Kate, I don't know if you'd like to check in on that.
Yeah. One specific example, I kind of touched on it earlier, is a cyclica, which sits at the cabinets of intersections in Seattle. It's along Mercer, which is where a lot of Amazon was built. And it abuts a highway, and it's a really messy corridor to go down. These sensors will use cell phone Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to see how many cars are there, and will adjust the signal timing accordingly. And so it's reduced the time to get down the corridor by 17 minutes. Now, the interesting thing about this specific example is it's entirely changed the experience of a pedestrian along the corridor. It's a lot more frustrating for pedestrian traffic. But that is one concrete example that Seattle is doing. I think some other examples with location data, one hypothetical I always wanted to see realized was safety for pedestrians, so that if someone is taking longer than they need to longer than the signal timing allows, rather, to cross the street, it will adjust the signal timing to allow that pedestrian to cross. And so it prioritizes more vulnerable people in the right of way than cars. There's a lot other, not necessarily down to individuals. Those are more individualized examples, but there's a lot of aggregate things that we can do. So if we understand that there's a big crowd in some space, for whatever reason, we can change how we're directing the right-of-way. Events are a very good example. If you have an arena and you know that for some reason a lot of cars are on one side, and you can redirect them to another with signs, not using, cell phone data or push notifications, but realizing where more or less clusters of people are. There's a lot of good examples there. And I know Jeanne listed some as well. So Jeanne, if you have any others to mention of using examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of examples where location data is helpful. Again, not for that individual, but for any individual in that position. So whether it's for pedestrian safety, as I mentioned before, or whether it's for just understanding that we have, a lot of people out and about in certain areas. We could open up a cooling center on a hot day to be able to help people who might need to be getting into shade. There's lots of instances, but I think it's important to acknowledge the fear and the concern that is behind that question, which is, I think given the reckoning that we're all coming to in America and that we're discussing openly about racism and inequities, that it's important to understand that people have these legitimate feelings, these legitimate concerns, because they have seen it be inequitable. And so even with the best of intentions, cities and governments have failed them in that equity conversation, and in a way that is not the same for a person who is a young Black man than it is for an older white man, or for somebody who's transgender. And so I think it's important for us to have this kind of conversation that we're having right now. So a huge shout out to the Luce Foundation and for American Geophysical to be able to have us talking about this in a way that brings all those different perspectives together, so that we can know when people want to share their information because they also see the public good, and when they want to restrict their information because there's a public trust issue.
Meghan, would you like to chime in?
Sure. So I agree with both Jeanne and Kate. And when I'm thinking about this question, the role of government is the residual claimant of responding to a crisis, and in that role is the need to protect and be the stewards of. Now, I get the question, why do they need to know my location? And I think we've heard some really good ideas about what's the applications, the ways it's being used. I know that some agencies are using it. So now you can detect how many people are in a place. So you don't want to be in a large crowd. Sometimes you walk into a place and there's so many people there and you did not know. It's not like it's a music event, but maybe a rest stop. So now there's going to be applications for you to know how many people are in a rest stop at any given time, so you can decide if you want to stop there. So I do believe that the location data is helpful, but I come back to the question. So many times we think, oh, we have to collect the data. We got to get this data. We got to get that data. Well, what's the question you're asking? Well, we're going to wait till we see the data. No, because we really got to figure out what the question is. So that's where I would go if I were working with the government. I'd say, what's the question we're trying to answer with this location data? And it's your question, all of government together, and how can we use it in a way where people don't feel like their privacy is being infringed?
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think
Please.
There has to be a way for us to figure out how to unveil the curtain of the technology that is being used and to develop trust. To me, the slide I mentioned earlier of explaining what the technology is doing, of who is using it, and then holding yourself to that in a very approachable way, so that, and then if the community has too much fear, do we use it? Like, the cities have to listen to the feedback, so that there is a new trust being developed. Because absolutely, Jeanne is right. We have got to make sure we're having honest conversations with the community on these things. We had a public comment period with automated license plate readers. And when we tried to get as many perspectives as possible, particularly from people of color, and our first meeting, we had a lot of uniformed police show up. And I was like, in no way is anyone going to talk about their fear of being surveilled in front of a uniformed policeman, right? But at the same time, we have to develop trust in the community. So it's really hard. It takes a lot of work, a lot of time. And again, it's this tension of we want to be innovative and quickly deploy in times of crisis, but we also have to make sure that we're communicating to the community what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is terribly interesting because, I mean, this is a state and local experiences, a U.S. state and local experiences panel. The first panel we convened was around vulnerable publics from an international perspective. So we had everything from, you know, advocates for South Asian migrant workers who were in the Gulf countries under basically indentured servitude, and, you know, the kind of surveillance that they're living under inside cities. We had some really interesting perspectives from East Asia, where, you know, the way of thinking about the priorities, right, is it was kind of human rights from a safety perspective rather than a privacy perspective. I'm not sure if that's the right trade-off, but some of our colleagues in Taiwan would talk about COVID-19 as a natural disaster. That was the mental frame they used. Just like, how do we use location data to protect our population from tsunamis, earthquakes, mudslides? And that when Jeanne gave the shake, was it the shake app? Yeah. You know, when you gave that, I was like, you know, that's how the Taiwanese are thinking about it. They're rolling out those apps because those are valuable to the public safety, and the trust they've built with their public is through that kind of safety mental frame. So anyways, I just think it's terribly interesting. You know, when we talk US, we have a whole set of cultural assumptions about how to have good government, but in our US vulnerable publics panel, we actually had the No Tech for ICE folks from Meghan. It's a nonprofit that they just look at ICE as an organization with no democratic accountability. So how can I be accepting of the tech if there is no recourse, there is no accountability? So part of what you are talking about is some notion of accountability in the technology as it relates to location. What do you advise, whether it's Meghan and Kate advising, or what have you implemented in cities to provide for accountability around me knowing what you know about my location? And maybe that's a bridge too far. Maybe nobody's gotten there yet.
Well, in that case, it's even a more important question to ask, I would say. So it's a very good one. I think the power of the audit is something that a lot of cities try to go to. In Seattle, we have a Office of Inspector General that was tasked with doing audits, and also the Office of the Auditor was going to look and make sure that whatever that report was designed for each technology, that departments were using the technology as agreed upon. So that, I think, is the first thing. Now, mind you, it's very expensive for cities to do these things and for audits. I think this is, I mean, Seattle pre-COVID was in a very good financial position generally. They have a 4-person privacy team. Kansas City could never afford a 4-person privacy team. So I think while that's in place from the auditing function, in terms of scalability with other cities, it's how can you be as transparent as possible so that when someone does ask to make sure, are you sticking to what you said you would do, those questions could be answered.
Great. Meghan.
Yeah, so for me, when I think of levels of government, so even if I live in LA and there's the city government of LA, it's still my neighborhood that I find that I am most in contact with. So when you're looking at the small to medium size cities and counties, towns, villages, they're the closest level to people. And in those cases, what I have found is that all meetings are public. Not everyone is asking about technology, but technology is on the agenda. So it's always an opportunity to weigh in. It may not be, oh, we're going to have a discussion today on how we have location data on all of our residents, but we're talking about technology investments, and it is a part of that. And so I always look to the lowest level of local government. You know, it might be 3 levels down. I'm embedded, you know, in a village, in a town, in a county.
Right.
So it's at that lowest level that I feel that these conversations are really where it occurs. And many times it's talking about what they're trying to carry out, not so much the technology. So they may say we have a system, but here's the service that we're trying to provide. Here's why we need this information.
And I find that social media is a great place for people to have conversations. Like, we are definitely held accountable. And we also, particularly like for the Shake Alert example, so we hear back on social media, we hear back from our reporters, God bless the fourth estate. And we also, since this is a mobile app, it's published in the Google Play and App Stores. And so you can get a lot of feedback there. And so we respond to each of those. This was the number one question, was what are you doing with my location data? So it wasn't like, how this is great, you know, thank you for making us safer during an earthquake. No, it was all about what are you doing with my location data? And that was an important conversation for us to have transparently, where other people could see our responses in the back and forth conversation, whether it was sort of these threaded emails within the App Store, or whether it was, you know, on Twitter, that you know, it's important for us to understand people's concerns and for us to make sure that the architecture that we had created was reflecting people's need for privacy. So I think it's important. I think it's just important to have these for city, at least in the public space, because you need to have those. You need to have the person who comes into that conversation 6 months from now understand, like, oh, I see all these people have had that conversation, because otherwise you're going to have it over and over again. And that is okay, but we really want to make sure that people understand that we're moving forward with this conversation.
Great. Anybody else want to pick up on that? But go ahead, Meg. Okay.
Nope.
Well, you know, so God, there's so many tensions here. So I mean, somebody picked up on the question that came in from our listeners on, you know, I live in a city and I don't want to be surveilled. Is there a way to opt out? And I think some of the tensions Meghan laid out, right, is in a way, you know, you need this data at a local level to be effective, because that's where things are being done. But at the same time, you know, like in my neighborhood, my nosy little neighborhood, you know, we know what's going on. You know, we walk our dogs every day. We kind of see who's coming and going, who seems to be social distancing or not social distancing. So in a way, at the lowest level where you need the implementation, you getting your data in other ways. I mean, it might be interesting to really look at your neighbor's mobile location data and to see if at midnight, you know, they're somehow cheating and I don't know, yeah, doing something sketchy. But by and large, it's that face-to-face interaction at the lowest level of governance that kind of makes things work. But it kind of breaks down at some level where you need data-driven policy. So like in opting out, like, is that a thing that I should be allowed to do? Like, sorry, I'm opting out of your system, city, or can I opt out at a certain jurisdiction? I don't even technologically know how one would do that, but like, is that something citizens should have the right to do? You know, how would we think out of? I mean, we're opting out of when somebody spams us in our email. You know, we unsubscribe, we opt out, but it doesn't seem like the tracking of our location over time is something that's really opt-outable.
I think to the extent you can, you should let people opt out. So, for example, Shake Alert LA is a mobile app. They don't have to download it, and they can turn off location services. It's not going to be helpful for them, but it will still give them information about, you know, after an earthquake, where's the local shelter and where they can get support and how they can help out. There's lots of other information. It won't do the one thing that a lot of people download it for, but it would also not do even this anonymized location assignment to a grid thing. The way that we do the symptom tracking is we don't do it. It's an opt-in choice with UCLA running that, and lots of other groups run them too, but in LA, that's the biggest one. So I think in most cases, we should let people have that choice. In some cases, they don't necessarily have that choice, but we try to anonymize it. So for example, the videos we showed of people around an intersection, one of the things we're doing this year to augment that research is exactly, I think Kate mentioned it, is if I need more time to cross the street. So we're actually able to tell that there's a person on a scooter and count that differently than a person walking, and count that now differently than a person who is in a wheelchair or pushing a stroller or a push cart, because all three of those people need more time to cross the street. And we can't tell the difference with the bad cameras we've got, but we can tell that there's a thing in front of a person that's moving. And so in that case, you can't just like put a black, sheet over and obscure yourself with the camera, because we consider it, part of how we're managing public safety on the streets. But we also don't keep that video data beyond the decision point at which we're making it. So I think in most cases we try to let people opt in. In some cases we push it. When we say this is, an anonymized data that we're using for public safety.
Great. Kate?
I was thinking about trying to go to London and not being put on camera. It's very difficult. And it kind of goes back to my original, your expectation of privacy. So all of these examples are very good because it's a city using it to better operate itself. It's not a city using your data against you. And I think that's an important clarification. I will say, if you'll venture with me to nerd out for a moment on a legal case, Jones, a very famous one. It's basically in the public right of way, your expectation of privacy is low. You've put yourself in the public ether. And technically someone can follow you. Now, this case is a good one because a police put a tracker on the bottom of a car for 3 weeks, and the car drove around and it followed the location. And the judge came back and said, well, you've gone beyond the natural human capability of following in the public right of way, and now you need a warrant. Right. So if a city's going to use your data against you, they have to have a warrant. Like pretty much. It depends on how the technology uses, but otherwise you're in the public right of way. And so cities are really trying hard to make sure no personally identifiable information is gathered. But that is the gray area, certainly.
Meghan.
So I'm always looking to see how we can add to the discourse on a topic. And to me, the idea of tracking location data is, I don't know if anybody's read the Surveillance Capitalism book by Shoshana, and it's great. And she just did a smaller piece in the New York Times. But to me, it's understanding the surveillance that already occurs in applications, raising a level of awareness of how it occurs in social media and applications, so we can have a more informed discussion and debate over government's role in this. So government has to be, they're the stewards of our data. So they're saying that they're going to collect location data. Many times you don't know what's being collected in private industry. And so the whole thinking there is there a way that we can infuse this type of knowledge at a younger generation, which we know is more willing to share everything about themselves through these applications, in order to inform the discourse in a different way, and it not just being government collecting location data, but all entities and across all sectors. So that's where I'd like to go, is that different type of conversation.
Yeah. So I have another question that came in that it actually echoes something from a previous panel that we had. And it was really about that vast marketplace, or you might want to call it kind of gray market of mobile location data being collected by various companies under one, terms of use, and then kind of sold. And they may even be abiding by their terms of use, but just nobody ever read it when they clicked it. Or they're aggregating or anonymizing, et cetera. But with today's technology, it's pretty easy enough to de-anonymize a lot of that stuff. And then there's this evolving ethos where that's just being sold to government, particularly in the federal government. This is brought up in the context of ICE. You know, it's like, hey, this is commercially available data. Would you like to use it to enhance your Palantir analysis? And then we go, oh, cool, commercially available. Why wouldn't I want to do my job better? But then next thing you know, like the vast kind of gray market of data is you know, being concatenated, smushed together to kind of meet all sorts of different mission goals that nobody intended originally. Do you see, is that a federal boogeyman that isn't really a local boogeyman? Is that something that, is that an ethos that you have to train your people? Don't buy that commercially available data, even though it might help you do your job better. You know, how do you guys think about that at state and local level? And I think the
boogeyman can live at any level, right? I mean, and you know, elected officials come and go. So I don't want to necessarily get into a political discussion, but depending on how individuals feel that, you know, they trust or don't trust the specific government at whichever level of government we're talking about, I think that there's, you know, you have to be aware of that when you're a government servant. And so I think that, you know, if I feel that Mayor Garcetti is, you know, very true to the values that I hold as a third generation Angelino, and I'm happy with him tracking my information to give me earthquake alerts, I may or may not be fine with his predecessor or his successor if I feel that that person doesn't hold the same values. And yet, as a government, we are likely going to be continuing to run that app, right? I mean, that's one of our services. We're likely going to continue to pave the streets and pick up trash and feed the animals at the zoo. And whatever connection we have will likely not change dramatically with the information that we use to be able to provision those services. So I think that the thing we have to think about is the transparency and the timeliness in which we retain that data. So be as clear as possible and be willing to take on some of those really uncomfortable conversations. Because if a conversation about what we're using that data for has us reflect on what we're doing and if it's the best possible way, and sometimes if it's even affordable to do it any other way, we may have to not do a service a certain way at all. And then secondarily, being clear that if we don't need that information beyond this point in time, we should like expunge it, so that somebody coming later with a different set of values or a different set of people working with them would not have the ability to dive into that data.
Great, thank you, Jeanne. Kate.
Yeah, I didn't go into it because I'm not an expert on it in the slightest of, you know, what GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Act is doing, but there's a certain sort of pillars of protection that's going on here. Chris, to your question of like the right to be forgotten, the right to be notified if your data has been monetized, if it's been sold to somewhere else. The state of Washington attempt to pass it, which is another important state based on, and Microsoft was for it, for something passing, and, you know, Amazon is there. So Washington would have been an important state. It ultimately failed over a lot of disagreement on enforcement. If it should be the AG who is breaking enforcement, or if it's me as an individual with my data can take someone to court, which could, and the discussion was that we would flood the courts. So I think, yes, I think it is what everyone has said so far. I think it's potentially, there's a lot of Telecom Act, you know, nuance involved of what sort of data cities can regulate, states can regulate, and the feds have to regulate. But those do need to be discussed for that very example that you mentioned.
Meghan, I didn't know if you want to chime in.
So many times when I'm talking and I'm working with government leaders around data, they want to talk about the specific data set, where it was collected, what system it's in, and we try to bump it up to a higher level of governance. And this happens in running IT departments, so IT investments. It happens in cyber programs. People want to talk about the thing and not about how you govern it. but really how you govern it gets to some of the questions that you just asked and allows you to have a forum, a process, the scope, authority by which to answer some of those questions. And governance isn't fun or sexy, although some people would say it is. I'd say it is. But many times you talk about the thing. You don't want to talk about the decision-making processes that allow you to make decisions about the thing. And so that's where I take a lot of people is, what does your data governance look like? Who's your data governance body? What's the scope of that group? Do they have any authority? And take them out of trying to always talk about the data, because establishing that will help get to some of the questions that you put forth.
Great. There's been mention about the census, but we have a very specific question. Kind of since Jeanne made the point about neighborhood level data is much more actionable, right? There's certain applications you need to, you know, I don't want to say de-anonymize it, but you need to understand certain attributes in order to have actionable local efforts. How will the differential privacy policy introduced by the census this year impact the ability of city and state leaders to deliver services to their citizens? Do you think there's any material change? Is that a debate? As we were setting up these panels, we ran into several folks that were deep into the differential privacy policy discussions around the census. Do you guys see that impacting how you deliver services? Has that even trickled down to you guys? Jeanne?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the languaging, again, I don't want to be political. The languaging around the census and the concerns that people have about their safety or the safety of their loved ones or the safety of their community if they answer the census is disturbing. So whatever party, I think one of the tenets of our Constitution is that a census should be done every 10 years. And so we want to have that as an accurate count of all people in the United States, even people who might be traveling here and not intending to be resident at all. It's meant to just be a point in time number. And so that includes people who are here legally, who are here without proper documentation, people who are transiting through the US, people who are homeless and don't have a specific residence. And we need it to be accurate. And it's important because our ability to provide services to people over the next 10 years will be determined by the number of people we have. So there's a lot of programs that basically say, for every one person you have, you'll get $100 of funding to do X. And if we really have 8 million people in the city, but only 4 million respond to the census, then we'll only get $50 per person. We won't be able to provision and support the services that people expect that we're doing and that the federal government thinks they're paying for us to do. And so we really want people to be able to share that information, even though I don't know if it's location. I guess it is location information, not real time, but location information. We want them to share that and know that it's going to be used for its intended purpose. And even if I'm here legally, if my father-in-law is here and undocumented, what I've heard from many people is that I don't want to answer that census because I'm afraid it's going to draw attention to him. And I don't see my current threat, my current risk is not worth the long-term payment in my mind, because I'll still get some government services.
Great. Anyone else want to pull that thread further? Okay. And then there's another question. Kate touched on the dichotomy between privacy and transparency. How can city leaders balance emerging principles of open data and efficient data reuse with protecting civil liberties? We're getting these like high level, like graduate school questions. So
it's a great question. And we just so happen to have the chief data officer of the city of Los Angeles on this panel that is dealing with that very thing. And before I hand it to Jeanne, who is really the best person to answer this question, we also worked with the Future Privacy Forum to do an analysis in Seattle on the open data that we were releasing to make sure that there was a, full privacy audit, that we weren't releasing anything that was too consequential in terms of privacy. I think it's a constant question that people like Jeanne Holm have to answer. So Jeanne, I'm curious your response.
If I haven't said the word transparency enough, that just the only way we can hold ourselves. So whether or not as a government service I have good intentions or bad intentions, the only way that you can tell that is if I'm transparent, and if I constantly allow myself to be, I think you used the word earlier, audited, but held accountable for the kinds of decisions I make. So I may make a decision you don't agree with, but I should be transparent about that, even if I'm not going to change the decision or change my mind on something, so that you can have the ability to take whatever appropriate action. Our understanding evolves over time, right? So when we started with COVID, we had these big aggregate, I'm trying to get back to COVID for you here, Chris. We started with COVID, we had these big aggregate numbers, nation, then state, then county. And what we've talked about here is that it really needs to be at your neighborhood or even smaller level. As we do that, suddenly we disaggregate the data and realize things aren't equitable. Now this idea of what we want to do with open data and how we want to use that data becomes different, because now that I know that it's not equitable, I can go ahead and put more testing centers in communities of color where there's a higher incidence or risk of getting COVID. So those people can get easier access to the testing because they don't have cars. And so we want to make sure that our evolving understanding adapts to the way in which we use the data. And the same is true in our discussions about racism right now. So right now we may collect data, many city websites collect data about demographics, but we might lump all people who have an identification with Asian together. When we disaggregate that data, we understand that our Filipino population may be very inequitably treated in relationship to our Japanese demographic. And so, as we start to understand things and we start to evolve and these conversations continue to be open and transparent, we can continue to evolve our ability to be supportive of the kinds of services we want to give people.
Great. Meghan or Kate? Yeah, Meghan?
So I think that, the idea of this tension between privacy and transparency, as if I put on my citizen of the United States hat, I always want it to be there. I always want there to be that tension and force the conversations around, the particular, the goal of collecting the data, the use, the potential second and third uses of it, because many times we, as government, we think about what is the primary use, but there's been a lot of research on the secondary and tertiary uses of data that can help inform government leaders. But I always want that tension to be there because I think that's where we get the most value. And I don't think it's I don't think it's something that's going to be solved, but we're going to make mistakes and we're going to figure it out, and we're going to learn from the larger municipalities and the states that are working towards it. We're going to learn from them. And I think that's one of the great things about having Jeanne on today is hearing some of these stories, and and especially Kate's stories about Seattle and Kansas City, because the smaller places, they're learning from this.
Yeah. I'll add just one quick experience from Kansas City. I went back to my law school and asked the question of what FOIA looks like for real-time data. And I think it's something that's still getting parsed out. And Professor Tony Lupino at the University of Missouri, Kansas City is really working on this. It's now being reviewed by Metro Labs, which is a partnership between cities and universities. But I mean, the way that traditional transparency, sorry, I'm nerding out again. Join me if you want.
Right, we like it.
Is, it asks for information that exists currently, right? So it's it's what data do you have? You traditionally have like a few days to turn it around. You can request for an extension. These things are talking about finite traditional government documentation. So I think that we're still working on what this actually looks like in terms of the new type of data that cities are working with.
Great. Well, I'd love to just end with one question. I'll throw the word out, policing, before I even ask the question, so you can gird your loins. I think in a post George Floyd world, I think you all have highlighted a lot of the issues that we need to be sensitive to, but we really haven't used the word policing. Sometimes we've been given the dichotomy of policing versus over-policing. And one of our, I'll call him a Data for Black Lives voices in a previous panel, he's not from Data for Black Lives, but I'll put him in that category. He was like, well, to some of us, that isn't a distinction, right? Like when you're the continuously over-policed population, right? It isn't a distinction of enforcing the law and over-policing. And then we just saw in Portland, right, the disclosure that DHS is actually collecting data on individuals and tracking that as intelligence and passing it to law enforcement. So, maybe you could just, I think you've given us a lot of wisdom. You've imparted a lot of important distinctions to our audience here. Maybe you could take a shot each at, putting that through the lens of how you look at policing, how you think about law enforcement, how you think about safety in that sense, so that people that are maybe on I don't know, different lived experiences with regard to that can have a little more, I'll just say, some more concepts in their mental toolbox to grapple with these things, because it doesn't seem like these things are going away anytime soon, though we all hope for progress. Anybody have any recent firsthand experiences with these issues they'd like to talk about? Jeanne, man, you are a great panelist, Jeanne. We appreciate you jumping in.
Sure. So like every large police force, okay, maybe not every, but like many large police forces in the United States, the Los Angeles Police Department is under scrutiny and coming to a reckoning with a lot of the practices they have. We have taken a couple of steps. Let me just mention this briefly, including taking about $150 million out of the police department and redirecting it to community investment projects. And even before COVID, so some time ago, the mayor had already announced the formation of a new civil rights department. And so that's a civil rights now and community investment department that's really focused around equity and is led by one of our amazing deputy city attorneys who's fought for these sorts of issues for a long time. We've also been making sure, and have for a long time, all California police departments have to submit information to the California Department of Justice related to use of force. And on our websites, you can find videos for every reported use of force instance. You can find all of our police officers, all 8,000, wear body cams at all times. And so you can find the video coverage of each of those instances and a verbal description of what's kind of going on and what happened. So I think it's a long, complex challenge to discuss all of this around policing. What I do know is, going back to our early discussion, is the transparency and the vulnerability that in which we have those conversations is important. To not be completely defensive as a government of what has happened in the past, and to start to potentially hold people accountable when lines are crossed. So there's a new Los Angeles rule that says that anytime a police officer unholsters their gun, whether they point it at somebody or not, it is considered a use of force. And it must be, and they must immediately be kind of brought in to describe and understand what happened there, which, I think is a step in the right direction. So I think that the idea of policing and location data means that we want to make sure people understand what crimes are happening around the city, what have been reported, what have been acted upon, and what may still be problems in certain communities if people haven't been arrested related to serial problems. At the same time, we need to make sure we're policing in the most appropriate and safe way for everybody.
Great. Kate or Megan?
Megan, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Megan.
So I think I'm going to bring it back to this idea of the use of data. And so for me, there's been, policing, public safety is a whole function of government that relies on data. And what we've learned, especially from the AI Institute, is that using past data to inform future actions is based on the biases of that data. So if we are to take recent events and thinking around policing, then it's important to look at the data and talk about, again, raise the discourse around the biases embedded in the data as ways to inform future decisions. And at all levels, at leadership level, at, we call them boots on the ground level. And so I think that's important, but it's also important to know that this is not the only function of government where they've had to dive into their own data to understand the biases. This happens in environmental protection. It happens in every area of government. And so that's one of the things that I would bring people back to, is understanding, the algorithms, understanding the biases that are in there, and really being open about coupling any type of AI intelligence with what we know about our communities, and just coupling that in a different way.
Wonderful, Megan. And we'll finish with you, Kate.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a pretty infamous story in Seattle that happened. And this is why I say how important it is to be transparent and not just passively put information up about what we're doing with technology and policing, but to proactively do it, because what we can see with our eyes and know will change people's response. And as a result of some grants that came out shortly after 9/11, DHS awarded Seattle a grant to put cameras along the waterfront close to where the Pike Place Market is. And they didn't really tell anyone. And so they put up all these cameras in one of the most highly trafficked areas of Seattle. And it looked like they were being pointed into people's apartments. And people freaked out, rightfully so. They thought they were just being watched in their homes. And it became such a pushback from the people of Seattle that they not only rejected the grant, but now the city has to put up money to take the cameras down. And that's because there was no understanding of what was going on, and no involvement with the community. Now, when you think about that, instead of a camera that's on your right of way on a pole that you can see with your eyes, of the technology that people can't see, and what would their reaction be, and how is this equitable in terms of the data that you're getting and explaining what you're doing with it, to open the conversations to really begin the analysis and the race and social justice conversations that need to happen across cities.
Well, thank you so much. I would just really like to thank all of you for your time. It's been an honor and a pleasure to share the internet with you. I'm not sure what I'm sharing with you right now. And your depth of expertise is something that I think all of our audience members are going to be able to benefit from as they grapple with this really complex set of issues. So thank you very much to Miss Meghan Cook, Miss Kate Garman, and Dr. Jeanne Holm. We also could not have done this, had this event, without the support of the Henry Luce Foundation, who has been with us from the beginning and will be with us until the end. So thank you for everyone who has attended. I'd also be remiss if I don't point out that we will be having a future set of events coming up over, for the rest of this week. We have a event on August 6th on data quality, false negatives, false positives, and policing and surveillance. Kind of building off the last point that we had in this discussion. Then we'll have a discussion on digital contact tracing tools featuring lead researchers from Harvard's Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, a recent report that a report they just recently released. And then we'll have one of our leadership spotlights, data technology and LGBTQ location privacy during COVID-19. It's a conversation with Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz from the United Nations on the 18th. So again, thank you to our panelists today. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and please be safe and keep healthy out there in cyberspace and in real space. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.